Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
My wife and I had just relocated for my new job at a tech startup. We were excited about our beautiful house with its white picket fence and manicured lawn. Little did we know we were stepping into the domain of a power-hungry tyrant. When we met the HOA president at the neighborhood welcome barbecue, he strutted around in an honest-to-God crown and cape, introducing himself with a grandiose title that implied he was royalty and the protector of the neighborhood. I thought it was a joke at first, but the fearful looks from our neighbors told a different story. The next day, there was a knock at our door. I opened it to find a teenager in a jester costume looking embarrassed. The young jester, clearly uncomfortable, delivered a message from the HOA president. He demanded we provide an expensive bottle of wine within 3 days or face consequences. When I expressed disbelief, the jester pleaded with us to comply, hinting at the president's tendency to become angry if people didn't play along. I closed the door, confused and a little amused. My wife wasn't as entertained. She expressed her reluctance to give in to such absurd demands, especially considering the high cost of the requested wine. I suggested we ignore it and see what happens. What followed was a series of increasingly bizarre royal decrees delivered by the poor jester kid. We were ordered to make outlandish changes to our property and acquire expensive items for the HOA president's use. Each time we refused, a fine would appear on our HOA bill. I tried reasoning with our neighbors, but they were too afraid to stand up to him. One neighbor advised us to simply comply, stating it was easier that way. Another shared a ridiculous story about how the HOA president had forced her husband to dress as a jester for a month due to improper hedge trimming. It was madness, but we stood our ground. That's when things escalated to truly ridiculous levels. One morning I woke up to the sound of trumpets. I looked out the window and nearly fell over in shock. Our front yard had been transformed into a medieval encampment, complete with striped tents and banners bearing the HOA president's made-up coat of arms. The man himself stood in the center, megaphone in hand, wearing full-plate armor. He declared a siege upon our house, demanding we submit to his authority. He had hired a group of medieval reenactors to surround our house. They even had a small catapult, which they used to launch rotten vegetables at our windows. I was ready to call the police, but my wife suggested a different approach. My wife, bless her devious heart, suggested we fight fire with fire. We reached out to some of our less timid neighbors and hatched a plan. The next day we emerged from our house in makeshift armor cobbled together from cardboard boxes and tinfoil. I held a plunger as my sword, while my wife brandished a mop like a spear. We loudly challenged the self-proclaimed king to a trial by combat, much to everyone's surprise. The HOA president, after a moment of shock, accepted our challenge with glee. What followed was the most ridiculous spectacle I've ever been part of. We engaged in a duel using pool noodles as swords, much to the amusement of the gathered neighbors. To everyone's surprise, my wife managed to knock the crown off his head with a well-aimed swing of her mop. The crowd gasped. Taking advantage of the moment, I seized the megaphone and declared the king defeated. I invoked ancient laws of combat to claim the right to put him on trial for his crimes against the neighborhood. To my amazement, the neighbors cheered. Even the reenactors seemed relieved to drop the act. We quickly organized an impromptu court in the community center with our neighbors as a jury. The trial was a farce, of course, but it served its purpose. We aired all the grievances against the tyrannical HOA president, from his outrageous demands to the arbitrary fines. Neighbors shared their absurd experiences, such as being forced to build moats or learn falconry for the president's entertainment. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. The HOA president was dethroned and banished from his position. We even made him walk down the street while the neighbors chanted, "Shame," and rang bells, much to his red-faced embarrassment. In the aftermath, we elected a new HOA board committed to actually serving the community rather than ruling it. As for the former king, Last I heard, he had moved to a nearby town and joined a Renaissance fair as a full-time performer. I guess some people are just born to wear a crown, even if it's made of plastic. Looking back, I can't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. What started as a nightmare turned into a bonding experience for the entire neighborhood. We still have the occasional medieval-themed block party, complete with turkey legs and mock jousting tournaments. But this time, everyone's in on the joke and no one's taking themselves too seriously. And me? Well, I kept the plunger sword as a memento. You never know when you might need to defend your castle after all. My husband and I moved into our new house about a year ago. We were excited to start a family in a quiet neighborhood. Little did I know our next-door neighbor would turn our lives upside down. It all started when I was pregnant. The neighbor, who I'll call Karen, seemed overly interested in my pregnancy. She constantly asked about my due date, my plans for the nursery, and even tried to touch my belly without permission. I brushed it off as friendliness at first. When our baby girl was born, things got weird fast. Karen started showing up at our door unannounced, always with some excuse to see the baby. Karen would often appear unexpectedly, claiming she was in the neighborhood and wanted to check on the baby. I would try to politely decline, explaining that we were trying to get the baby to sleep. Karen would dismiss my concerns, insisting that babies need stimulation and offering to hold her. Despite my attempts to refuse, she remained persistent. One day, I caught her trying to take my baby for a walk without asking. When I confronted her, Karen casually explained that she thought she'd give me a break and take the baby for some fresh air. I firmly told her not to take my baby without permission, emphasizing that it wasn't okay. Karen brushed off my concerns, telling me not to be uptight and repeating the phrase about it taking a village to raise a child. I started locking our doors and keeping a closer eye on things. But Karen's behavior only escalated. She set up a full nursery in her house, complete with a crib, changing table, and toys. When I confronted her about it, she brushed it off. Karen explained that she thought it would be nice to have a space for the baby when she visits. When I pointed out that we had never asked her to babysit, Karen confidently stated that we eventually would, claiming she was much more experienced with children than I was. Things got even creepier when I discovered she'd been posting photos of my baby on her social media accounts, calling her by a different name and implying she was the mother. I immediately reported the posts and blocked her on all platforms. The final straw came when I received a notice in the mail. Karen had filed for custody of my daughter, claiming I was an unfit parent. The accusations were outrageous. Drug use, neglect, even abuse. All complete lies. I was in shock. How could this be happening? That's when my husband made a disturbing discovery in Karen's trash. She'd thrown out a bunch of files and curiosity got the better of him. What we found made my blood run cold. Karen had been keeping detailed records on our family. There were stolen photos, fake incident reports, she'd written up and even doctored images that made our home look unsafe for a child. She created an entire fantasy world where she was the baby's rightful mother. We immediately contacted the police and a lawyer. The evidence we found was damning, and Karen's lies quickly unraveled. It turned out she had a history of similar behavior in other neighborhoods. She'd moved around, always targeting new parents. The court case was a nightmare, but in the end, Karen was charged with harassment, attempted kidnapping, and falsifying evidence. She's now serving time in prison and has a restraining order against her for when she gets out. As for us, we've moved to a new town. It took a while to feel safe again, but we're finally starting to heal. Our daughter is happy, healthy, and blissfully unaware of the chaos she was born into. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted my instincts sooner. Karen's behavior was never normal, and I should have set firmer boundaries from the start. But who expects their neighbor to try and steal their baby? I've learned to be more cautious, but I refuse to let this experience make me paranoid. We've made new friends in our community, and this time, we're taking things slow, getting to know people before letting them into our lives. Sometimes I think about Karen, locked up in prison. I wonder if she ever realized how wrong her actions were, or if she still believes in the twisted reality she created. Either way, I'm just glad she's out of our lives for good. So that's my story. It sounds like something out of a crazy movie, but it really happened. If there's one thing I've learned, is to trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. And never be afraid to speak up and protect your family, no matter how awkward or confrontational it might feel. So there I was, planning my dream wedding with my fiancé. We'd been together for 5 years, and we finally felt ready to take the plunge. I'm a simple girl from a small town, and he's a city boy who swept me off my feet when we met at college. We both wanted a modest but beautiful ceremony, nothing too flashy, just a celebration of our love with our closest friends and family. We'd spent months carefully choosing every detail. The venue was this charming little barn on the outskirts of town, perfect for the rustic theme we wanted. I'd found the most gorgeous lace dress that made me feel like a princess without breaking the bank. Everything was falling into place and I was on cloud nine. Then, like a tornado sweeping through our carefully laid plans, my fiancé's grandmother decided to get involved. Now, don't get me wrong, I'd always gotten along fine with his grandma before. She was a bit eccentric, sure, but harmless enough. Or so I thought. It started with a phone call. My fiancé put it on speaker so we could both chat with her. His grandmother expressed her excitement about the wedding plans. I thanked her and mentioned how we were looking forward to it. Then she started talking about the venue. She said she'd been thinking about it and decided that the old barn wouldn't do. She told us she had already called the country club and they could fit us in next month. My fiancé tried to explain that we had already booked the barn and that we liked it, but his grandmother dismissed this idea, insisting that we couldn't possibly want to get married in what she called a dirty old building. She claimed the country club was much more suitable. Before I could protest, she moved on to the topic of my dress. She mentioned seeing an exquisite gown in a downtown boutique and told me she had scheduled a fitting for the next week. I tried to tell her that I had already found my dress and that I loved it, but she just laughed, saying she was sure whatever I picked was nice, but that I needed something truly special for this once-in-a-lifetime event. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about our wedding at all. Somehow, in her mind, this had become her do-over wedding. Over the next few weeks, it was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Every time we turned around, she changed something else. The guest list doubled in size, mostly to accommodate her bingo buddies from the senior center. Our carefully chosen menu was scrapped in favor of her favorite foods. She even tried to convince us to change our first dance song to the one from her own wedding. My fiancé and I were at our wits' end. We tried talking to her, but she always had an excuse or brushed off our concerns. Finally, we decided to put our foot down at the rehearsal dinner. I tried to initiate a conversation about the wedding with his grandmother. She immediately started talking about her latest idea for the centerpieces. My fiancé interrupted her, telling her firmly that this had to stop and that it was our wedding, not hers. His grandmother reacted dramatically, acting shocked and hurt. She asked how we could say such a thing after everything she'd done for us. I tried to explain that while we appreciated her help, she was taken over and this wasn't what we wanted. That's when she pulled her trump card. Right in the middle of the restaurant, she let out an ear-piercing shriek and collapsed to the floor, clutching her hip. She cried out in pain, claiming she thought she'd broken something. Of course, everyone rushed to her aid. The evening was ruined, and somehow we ended up being the bad guys for upsetting poor grandma. The next day, we got a call from the hospital. Miraculously, nothing was broken. The doctors suggested it was probably just a muscle spasm, but grandma milked it for all it was worth, insisting she needed to stay for observation. I was a bundle of nerves on our wedding day. I half expected her to show up in an ambulance, complete with a dramatic entrance on a stretcher. But as I peeked out at the guests arriving, my jaw dropped. There she was, Grandma, strolling in bold as brass, wearing a white wedding gown. Not just any white dress, mind you. No, this was a full-on bridal gown, complete with a veil, and a train longer than mine. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. This was it. She was going to ruin everything. But then I caught sight of my fiancé, standing at the end of the aisle, looking at me with nothing but love in his eyes. and suddenly I knew exactly what I had to do. As the music started and I began my walk down the aisle, I made a detour. I walked right up to Grandma, who was preening and soaking up the shocked gasps from the other guests. In a low voice, I told her that it was a nice try, but this was my day and she wasn't going to ruin it. Before she could react, I grabbed a nearby glass of red wine and, with a look of exaggerated surprise, tripped. The wine went flying, splattering all over her pristine white gown. I feigned an apology, saying I was so clumsy, but assured her not to worry, as I was sure it would come out eventually. She opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water, unable to form words. Then, with a huff, she stormed out of the barn. The rest of the wedding was perfect. Sure, there were a few whispers about the wine incident, but most of our guests were just relieved that Hurricane Grandma had blown over. As for Grandma, she didn't speak to us for months after that. But you know what? It was worth it. Because in the end, we got the wedding we wanted. A celebration of our love, surrounded by people who truly cared about us. And if that meant standing up to an entitled grandmother who thought she could hijack our special day, well, that's just what we had to do. I was tired of living in a tiny apartment in the city, so I decided to buy an old house in the suburbs. I'd saved money for years by working extra hours at my accounting job. Finally, I found the perfect place. A cute two-story house with a white fence and a big backyard. It needed some work, but I was excited to fix it up. Everything was great for the first few months. I was settling in, slowly fixing up each room and getting to know my neighbors. Then she moved in next door. At first, she seemed nice. She brought over a welcome basket and introduced herself. But things got weird when she started asking very specific questions about who used to live in my house. A week later, I came home from work to find her measuring my fence with a tape measure. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was checking the property lines because her family used to own my house. I tried to explain that there must be a mistake, but I could see she didn't believe me. Things got crazy after that. One day, I came home to find my front door wide open. I rushed inside thinking I'd been robbed. Instead, I found her in my living room with a bunch of movers bringing in her furniture. I asked what was going on and she calmly said she was moving back into her family's old home. She even said I could keep some of my stuff as her tenant. I was so shocked I could barely speak. I called the police right away. When the cops arrived, she showed them some fake papers about her family owning the house. The police looked as confused as I felt. While they were arguing, I noticed people setting up for a party in my backyard. My neighbor said it was her housewarming party. The police got everyone to leave, but my neighbor locked herself in my bedroom. She kept yelling through the door that the house was hers and I needed to move out. I ended up in a weird legal battle. My neighbor hired a lawyer who said he specialized in ancestral property rights. I had to get my own lawyer to defend my obvious ownership of the house. For weeks, my life was crazy. I had lots of meetings with lawyers, and my neighbor kept trying to reclaim different rooms in the house. She even said a rose bush in the yard proved she owned the place because her great-aunt planted it. Things changed when a local news station showed up to do a story about us. As they were getting ready to film, I saw a van across the street with more cameras inside. Suddenly, a man with a headset ran up to us. He said he was from a TV show called Neighbor Nightmares. He told everyone to stop because things had gone too far. The man explained that my neighbor was supposed to be acting for their show, but she got too into her character. It was all meant to be a harmless prank, not a real fight over the house. The neighbor, whose real name was Karen, looked confused and then really embarrassed when she realized what had happened. The police came again and took her to see a doctor. In the end, I got my house back, and the TV company paid me for all the trouble they caused. Karen had to go to therapy and move to a different neighborhood. And me? I got a crazy story to tell and learned to appreciate boring, quiet days at home.
And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.